A body slammed into a wooden wall so hard the boards cracked. Two men circled each other on a bare concrete floor. One was breathing fast. The other wasn't breathing at all. Just watching, completely still, feet barely moving. Then the bigger man lunged. What happened in the next 3 seconds made the man holding the camera step backward without realizing he'd moved. Nobody in that room said a word. The footage sat locked away in a box for decades. Hidden. Forgotten. And when it finally surfaced, the people who knew these two men best, trainers, historians, fighters who'd spent their entire lives studying both of them, watched it once, rewound it, and watched it again. Every single one of them said the exact same thing. What is this? That man. That moment. Nobody knew Bruce Lee was capable of what that camera caught. Stay with me on this one. To understand what that footage means, you have to understand who these two men actually were. Not the legends. The men. Bruce Lee by 1971 was already famous. Enter the Dragon was in production. Hollywood knew his name. Magazines wanted interviews. People stopped him on the streets in Hong Kong and Los Angeles both. To the world outside martial arts, he was a movie star who happened to know how to fight. But the people inside martial arts, the ones who actually trained, who actually competed, who'd actually been hit, they knew something different. They knew Bruce wasn't just an actor who could move well. They knew what he actually was. And they didn't talk about it openly, because talking about it meant admitting something that didn't fit neatly into any existing category. Bruce Lee had developed a system he called Jeet Kune Do. The name translates roughly to the way of the intercepting fist. But calling it a system almost undersells it. It was closer to a philosophy with teeth. He'd taken apart every martial art he'd ever studied. Wing Chun, boxing, wrestling, fencing, and kept only what worked. He threw away everything else. Every tradition, every ceremony, every technique that looked good but didn't land in real situations. What was left was fast, direct, and brutally efficient. And he was small, 5'7" on a good day, maybe 135 pounds soaking wet. When people met him for the first time, that was always the shock. He looked like somebody's younger brother. Nothing about his size prepared you for what happened when he moved. Now, Joe Louis. If Bruce Lee was the smartest fighter anyone had ever seen, Joe Louis was the most dangerous one. He wasn't a movie fighter. He wasn't a demonstration fighter. He was the real thing, and everyone in the martial arts world in 1971 knew it. Louis stood 6'1", weighed around 200 pounds. He'd served in the Marine Corps. He studied Shorin-ryu karate while stationed in Okinawa and came back to the United States and started winning. He won. And then he kept winning. He became the first world professional karate champion and held that title for years. His left kick was so fast and so hard that other fighters specifically trained not to stand on his left side. He'd knocked out serious, experienced competitors in ways that ended careers. The thing about Joe Louis that people sometimes miss is this. He wasn't just physically dangerous. He was smart. He studied opponents. He prepared. He was not the kind of man who walked into a room without understanding exactly what was in it. And Joe Louis was one of the small number of people Bruce Lee personally trained. That relationship started in the late 60s. Louis came to Bruce wanting to learn. He already had power. He already had conditioning. What he didn't have, what he knew he didn't have, was what Bruce Lee was doing with his hands and feet. That impossible timing. That thing where a strike seemed to start and land in the same instant. Louis wanted to understand it. So he found Bruce and he asked. Bruce took him on. That wasn't something he did for just anyone. They trained together through the late 60s and into the early 70s. Louis credited Bruce openly for transforming how he fought. He said it in interviews. He didn't have to say it. He was the champion. He could have said whatever he wanted, but he said it because it was true. Bruce Lee had changed the way Joe Louis understood his own body and what it could do. But here's the thing. Crediting a teacher is one thing. That's public. That's respectful. What happened in those private training sessions, what the two men did when it was just them and a handful of people who were allowed to be there, that was kept quiet. Not out of shame. Out of respect for something that was hard to describe. You don't broadcast something you don't fully understand yourself. In the fall of 1971, they had a session at a private gym in Los Angeles. Just a few people in the room. Somebody had a camera, a small handheld film camera, the kind that was common enough in those years. Nobody made a big deal of it. The camera was just there. The people in that room had seen both men train before. They thought they knew what a session between them looked like. Bruce demonstrating something. Lewis working on it. Some back and forth. The kind of thing that ends with both men nodding and reaching for water. That was the expectation. And for the first 20 minutes or so, that's exactly what it was. Then it changed. The first 20 minutes were what you'd expect from two men who knew each other's games. Bruce showed Lewis something specific, a way of collapsing the distance between two fighters so fast that the opponent's reflexes couldn't fire in time. Lewis worked on it. He was always a good student, even as a champion. He didn't let ego get in the way of learning. That was part of why he'd stayed at the top. Bruce moved around him, correcting small things. A shoulder angle, the height of the guard, the weight distribution through the back foot. When Bruce Lee corrected a position and then touched you lightly, you felt how different it was. You felt the force organized differently in your body. It wasn't mystical. It was physics, but it felt like something more. Then Lewis threw a combination. A real one. Not a slow demonstration throw. A fast, committed, full-speed combination. The kind he threw at opponents in competition. The kind that had ended fights. And Bruce wasn't there. Not in the sense that he stepped back or blocked. In the sense that he was standing in one place and then he was in a different place and the combination had passed through the air where he used to be. The people watching said later they couldn't explain exactly what they'd seen. Their eyes had tracked Lewis, who was easy to track. A big man with big movements, and somehow Bruce had simply ceased to be in the target zone. Lewis stopped. He looked at Bruce. Something shifted in his expression. Not anger. Curiosity. A fighter's curiosity, the kind that means, I want to understand what just happened so I can either do it or prevent it being done to me. He came again. Faster this time. And again Bruce was gone. Not stepped back. Not blocked. Gone. Standing in a different position, balanced, relaxed, looking at Lewis the way you look at someone you're having a conversation with. Lewis started to push harder. This is where it started to become something other than a training session. A training session has a rhythm. Attack, respond, reset, discuss, repeat. When the rhythm breaks, when one person stops resetting and just keeps coming, it becomes something else. Lewis stopped resetting. He kept going. And you could feel it in the room. The man with the camera felt it because he stopped moving to find better angles and just held the camera pointed at the two of them and kept it there. What happened over the next several minutes was the real inciting incident. Not a single dramatic moment, but a building series of exchanges, each one a little faster, a little harder than the last. Lewis was testing something. He was trying to find the ceiling. He wanted to know where Bruce Lee's capability ended. The room got quiet. Not awkward quiet, still quiet. The kind of quiet where people stop whispering to each other because they don't want to miss anything. Bruce was still relaxed. That was the thing everyone in that room would talk about later. Lewis was working, you could see it in his face, in his breathing. Bruce looked like he was standing at a bus stop. And the harder Lewis came, the more relaxed Bruce seemed to become. Then Lewis caught him. Not a knockout. Not a clean strike. But contact, real, solid, undeniable. A glancing shot off the shoulder that snapped Bruce's head to the side. A real hit. The kind that, if you're not braced for it, takes something out of you. Lewis stepped back. The room shifted. People held their breath. Bruce straightened up, rolled his shoulder once, looked at Lewis, and smiled. Not a performance. Not a movie smile. A real one. The smile of a man who just received important information and found it interesting. What followed were 3 exchanges that the man with the camera captured in full. Exchanges that analysts with access to high-speed enhancement would later describe as sitting at the absolute outermost edge of what human reflexes and conditioning were supposed to be able to produce. Lewis came hard. Bruce answered. But this time he answered differently. Not just moving away. Answering with contact of his own, precise, controlled, targeted with a specificity that was almost unsettling. Not to hurt, to demonstrate. Each touch saying, I was here. I could have. I chose not to. The third exchange ended with Lewis backing up 3 steps and the back of his right leg hitting a wooden partition along the wall. The boards cracked. Not splintered, cracked, the way boards crack when something heavy backs into them with force. Lewis put his hands down. Bruce put his hands down. Someone handed them water from a cooler near the wall. Lewis took the cup and drank most of it in one go. He was sweating. His shirt had darkened at the chest and under both arms. Bruce accepted a cup, took a small sip, and held it loosely at his side. They stood 6 feet apart. Neither of them spoke right away. Lewis looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked at Bruce. Something passed between them, not words, not a gesture. Just a look. One of the observers sat down on a bench near the far wall. Someone said something quietly and got a short, tired laugh. The man with the camera lowered it slightly, keeping it running but no longer holding it up. The session was finished. Everyone in that room believed it. Lewis had pushed. Bruce had answered. The edge had been found. Both men were standing. The story was over. They were wrong. Joe Louis set his water cup down on the cooler. He looked at Bruce Lee and said 4 words. Do it for real. Not as a challenge. Not angry. He said it the way a man says something he's been thinking about for a long time and has finally decided to say out loud. 4 words that changed every assumption in the room about what kind of story this was going to be. Because a training session between a teacher and a student, that's one kind of story. A professional session between 2 men who've worked together for years, that's a version of the same story. But 2 men who've spent the last half hour testing each other, and now one of them has asked the other to stop holding back. That's a different story entirely. That's not demonstration. That's not practice. That's a question with a physical answer. And everyone in that room understood it. Bruce Lee looked at Lewis for a long moment. Nobody moved. Then Bruce said, "Okay." 1 word. And the dynamic in the room shifted. The man with the camera brought it back up. He didn't think about it. He just did it, the way you do things when you understand that what's in front of you is something you can't afford to miss. Lewis rolled his neck. He shifted his weight. He came at Bruce with full intent. Not sparring intent. Full intent. The kind that Joe Louis used in championship fights. The kind that had put serious fighters on the floor. What happened in the first 3 seconds is the thing experts have spent years trying to explain. Lewis threw a combination, left jab, right cross, left hook. Fast. Not fast for demonstration. Fast. The kind of speed that professional evaluators later, watching footage at reduced frame rates, said exceeded anything they'd seen documented in a non-controlled setting from that era. Bruce didn't step back. He stepped inside. Into the combination. Inside the arc of the hook, into the space where Lewis's arm had no power, and then Bruce's hand was at Lewis's throat. Touching it. Not striking. Touching. 1 finger. Extended. Resting against the side of Joe Louis's neck. It happened so fast that the people in the room didn't see it as it happened. They saw the beginning of Lewis's combination, and then they saw Bruce standing inside it with 1 finger at Lewis's throat. The space between those 2 things, that fraction of a second, wasn't visible to the naked eye in real time. Lewis froze. He stayed completely still, Bruce's finger resting against his neck. 2 men, 6 inches apart, both understanding what had just been communicated without a word. That finger could have been something else. It could have been a palm heel, a thumb strike, 100 other things that would have ended the conversation permanently. Bruce had made a choice about what it would be. And that choice was the answer to Lewis's question. Lewis stepped back. He didn't look angry. He looked, and people who were in that room have used this word specifically, stunned. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. Because what happened next is the thing that rewrote everything. Lewis came back. He didn't walk away. He didn't call it. He came back, and this time he did something nobody had expected. He stopped throwing combinations and switched to a takedown, a shoot. He dropped his level and drove forward, trying to get Bruce around the waist and put him on the ground. It was a smart adjustment. A champion-level adjustment. If you can't hit a man standing up, you change the game. You go to the floor where size matters. Where 200 pounds of Marine-trained karate champion means something. It was the logical move and Lewis executed it perfectly. Bruce wasn't on the ground. Not because he jumped. Not because he was lifted. Because in the moment Lewis's hands should have closed around his waist, Bruce was behind him. On his feet. Balanced. Both hands free. Lewis spun. Bruce was already facing him. The room had gone completely silent. No quiet comments. No shifting on benches. 3 or 4 people completely frozen, watching something that none of their existing knowledge had prepared them to process. Lewis stood up straight. He looked at Bruce. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. Then he laughed. Not a performance laugh. A real one. Surprised and genuine. Full of something that sounded almost like relief. Like a man who'd been carrying a question for a long time and had finally gotten the answer, even if the answer was bigger than he'd expected. Bruce laughed too. They shook hands. 2 men who'd just done something that nobody outside that room was going to understand for a very long time. One of the observers, a man who'd been training in martial arts for 15 years and had attended Bruce's private sessions before, said afterward that he didn't speak for the rest of that day. Not because he was in shock exactly, because he needed time to understand what to do with what he'd seen. He said, "I had a framework for understanding what great fighters can do. What I watched that afternoon didn't fit in that framework. I had to build a new one." The man with the camera kept rolling. He captured the handshake, the laughter, the quiet conversation as both men cooled down. He captured Lewis shaking his head slowly. Not in disbelief, but the way you shake your head when something large has settled into place. He captured Bruce standing with his water cup, talking quietly, gesturing with one hand to explain something about angles and timing, as casual as a man describing the best route to the freeway. The footage ran for another 12 minutes after the handshake. Then the camera ran out of film. The man holding it looked down at it. He'd captured something. He knew that much, but he didn't know what to do with it. So he put it in a case, brought it home, and there it stayed. The man who had that film canister held onto it for decades. He didn't destroy it. He didn't sell it. He just held onto it. First in a case, then in a box that moved with him through several houses over the years. He died in 2009. His family found the box in a storage unit. They didn't know what was on the film. It took them 2 years to find someone who could process it properly, because the type of film stock wasn't something anyone was handling commercially anymore. When they finally got it developed and transferred to digital, they watched it. And then they called a man named Daniel Huang, a martial arts historian who'd spent 30 years documenting the development of Jeet Kune Do and its influence on Western combat sports. They called him because they didn't know who else to call. They'd watched it once and they knew they were out of their depth. Huang flew to Los Angeles. He sat in a room with the family and watched the footage. He watched it through once without stopping. Then he asked to see it again. Then he asked to take it frame by frame through the critical exchanges. He didn't say much during that process. He sat forward in his chair. He started breathing through his mouth, the way people do when something has engaged them at a level that bypasses normal social awareness. When he finished, he sat back. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you understand what's in this footage?" The family said they weren't sure. He said, "Nobody does, because nobody's seen this before." What Huang identified and what a subsequent group of analysts confirmed, including 2 former professional fighters, a kinesiologist from UCLA, and a biomechanics researcher who'd spent years studying elite human movement, was this: Bruce Lee's response initiation in the documented exchanges was not within the normal range for elite athletic performance. Not slightly outside the range. Significantly outside it. The analysts, working with frame-by-frame footage and movement tracking tools, put his response time at somewhere between 40 and 55 milliseconds from stimulus to movement. The known range for elite athletes under full-intensity conditions is 80 to 100 milliseconds. The best-tested fighters in the world clock in around 40 to 55 milliseconds. To put that in physical terms, it means Bruce Lee was moving before Joe Louis's strike had fully committed. Not guessing. Not anticipating based on pattern recognition. Moving. In response. After the stimulus had fired. The kinesiologist said, when she published her analysis, that she'd rechecked the footage 17 times before she was willing to put her name on those numbers. She said, "I understand that this sounds like I'm describing something impossible. I'm not describing it as impossible. I'm describing it as the furthest documented example of this capacity in a human being that I'm currently aware of." Now, Joe Louis. Joe Louis died in 2012. He never publicly discussed what happened in that training session, not in any interview, not in any of the martial arts publications he contributed to over the years. But in 2003, he gave a private talk at a training camp in Arizona. Someone recorded it on a handheld device. In that talk, Louis mentioned Bruce Lee. He described training with him. He said, and this is the line that people who've heard that recording come back to, he said, "There was one afternoon where I understood that I had been training my whole life to be second best in a room with him." He didn't say when. He didn't say where. He didn't describe it further. But now, with the footage, people understand what afternoon he was talking about. The moment on the film that no one can stop watching, the one people with access to it describe returning to specifically, is not one of the combat exchanges. It's the moment after the second development. After Louis's takedown attempt failed. After both men were standing and the room was silent. Louis's face. Just his face, for about 2 seconds before he laughed. Fighters who've watched that moment say it's the most honest thing they've ever seen on film. Not fear. Not confusion. Something more specific than either of those. The look of a man who competed at the highest level and now knew exactly what he was looking at. Who recognized that what had just been done to him could not have been done by anyone else alive. And who felt something that might have been gratitude because you only get to be in a room when something like that happens once. That look. 2 seconds of Joe Louis's face. That's the payoff. What the experts say now, after time with the footage, is that the most important thing it reveals isn't the speed. It isn't the numbers. It isn't the reaction time measurements or the kinesiological data. Those things are remarkable, but they're not the most important thing. The most important thing is the control. Any discussion of Bruce Lee's ability before this footage eventually ran into the same wall. People talked about his speed and it was documented. He did demonstrations, he did controlled tests, there's footage of those things. But demonstrations are designed. The other person is cooperating. What you learn from a demonstration is that someone is very fast in cooperative conditions. What this footage shows is something different. It shows control under resistance. It shows a man making choices, not reflexive ones, chosen ones, at a level of speed and precision that had previously been theoretical. The finger at Louis's throat wasn't an accident of circumstance. It was a decision. At 40 to 55 milliseconds, a decision was made. That's the thing that shifts everything. Not speed alone. Not power alone. Decision at that speed. The capacity to be not just fast but precise and intentional while being fast. To have something to say with your hands, and to say it exactly under full pressure, against a man who was trying his absolute best to hit you. Bruce Lee died in July 1973. He was 32 years old. He never saw Enter the Dragon released. He never saw himself become the most recognizable martial artist in human history. He never knew that 50 years after he stood on a concrete floor in Los Angeles and answered a question with one finger resting against a man's neck. 50 years after that afternoon, people would still be trying to understand what he was. Joe Louis spent the rest of his career fighting and teaching. He was generous with what he knew. He ran camps. He trained fighters who went on to win titles. He talked about Bruce openly, always positively, always with a specific kind of weight in his voice when the name came up. He never described that afternoon. Not publicly, but he carried it. The wooden partition along the back wall of that gym, the one Louis backed into, the one that cracked, stood there for 3 more years before the space was converted into something else. The building was eventually torn down. Nobody photographed the wall specifically. Nobody knew to, but the cracked boards were there. Real. Physical. The mark of something that had actually happened between two real men on an ordinary afternoon that turned out to be anything but. The footage is in careful hands now. It'll likely be seen by more people. When it becomes widely available, if it does, the conversation around Bruce Lee is going to shift. Not because the legend will grow, but because something better than the legend will exist. The proof will exist. And proof, unlike legend, doesn't require belief. You either see it or you don't. The man holding that camera on that afternoon didn't know what he was capturing. He just knew something was happening that he needed to keep in frame. He stepped backward when the first exchange started. You can see the footage jostle, the frame shift slightly, and then he steadied himself and held on. He held on for 23 minutes. He used every frame of film he had. Standing in a gym in Los Angeles, watching two men who would both become legends, he pointed a camera at what was real and kept it there. That's all he did. And because he did, we now have something that 50 years of stories and films and interviews couldn't give us. We have a moment where nobody was performing, where nobody was thinking about legacy or reputation or what any of it would look like from the outside, where two men were simply asking and answering the most direct question their world had to offer. What are you capable of? A body slammed into a wooden wall so hard the boards cracked. That's how this story started. Now you know what was behind it.